as we again concentrate on the presence of God within us might be an extension of what we just prayed in the chapel. So again, let us have recourse to the founder to help us concentrate on the presence of God within us this morning. Should I not be constantly moved to think of you, my God, considering that you are always with me and in me, and that I can do nothing of myself? All my thoughts and acts should remind me of your presence and bring me closer to you. The very beatings of my heart are so many warnings, calling me to give you all that I have and all that I am. Inspire my mind with these sentiments and move my heart in like manner, so that the mind may think only of you and the heart occupy itself only with your love. Say, John Baptist, Lasallian.
Pray for us.
Live Jesus in our hearts.
Forever.
Could I call your attention to the reading list for a moment? And there are two things to say about the readings that are listed for tomorrow. The first is that they are very extensive, 150 pages again. And the second thing is, if you'll notice, can't find the damn thing. Yes, there we are. We go out of sequence a little bit in the blank. Under number 12, so for tomorrow, you have to finish all of book 2 and the first 12 pages of book 3, the third volume, or the third book that you have. And then, after page 12, you jump to page 40 to 45. Pages 13 to 49 cover the Rouen thing, but I think it's better to skip that for the moment to keep things in sequence in Paris, to get our work for tomorrow really is to look at the founder in the face of these major obstacles and controversies, first those set up by the diocese and the cardinal and the pastor, and then those set up by the writing masters and the schoolmasters. So we have those two big fundamental conflicts with the establishment. Now, to be honest with you, I really regret the fact that the schedule's been changed. So from my point of view, it would have been much better if we were to have this the session as scheduled on Friday, because it would give you more time to read this stuff carefully. Matter of fact, I suppose I wouldn't be altogether opposed to going back to the original schedule for this group, but I guess there wouldn't be too much sentiment for that, would there? But that puts a pretty heavy burden on you for this afternoon and this evening to read through all of that, and it's kind of complicated. But it is terribly, terribly important. And so do what you can with it, and we'll try and see if we can address all of that tomorrow. And that will leave next week for us to deal with Rouen, the expansion, and the final years of the founder in the 3 sessions left to us for next week. And I really hope today to be able to get as far as the readings would bring us, and that is to the establishment at Avignon in 1702. So we'll turn the corner from the 17th to the 18th century, I hope, this morning. Okay, so there's just a few things that we really, in a sense, have finished this, but founder comes to Paris in 1688. We had all that business with the school. We have a new pastor. Now, this is another thing to keep track of these pastors of Saint Sulpice. First, it was de la Barmondière who brought him there. And even though de la Barmondière, of all of the pastors of Saint Sulpice, looks like kind of on the founder's side, it's very interesting that he falls hook, line, and sinker for all of those calumnies that were set up against the founder by Compagnon. And through the pious ladies and all that. And it was really cool to De La Salle and practically was ready to let him go. Now, this is a theme that runs through the founder's life, so much of his life. And his work was centered in this parish of Saint-Sulpice. So the whole question of the relationship of the founders, the Sulpicians, I think, is a very interesting theme to look at, and especially the conflict with these pastors. But if you remember what we said about the way the thing was structured, the really full control of the charity schools in each parish was in the hands of the pastor. So the founder was very dependent on the pastors on the one hand, and on the other hand, he wanted to be independent of them, and especially in what concerned the manner of running the schools and the internal life of the community of brothers. And so this was a kind of a tightrope that he had to walk all the time. And the pastors were really, well, pastor rhymes with another word that's not very flattering. And I think most of them were more entitled to the word that begins with a B than the one that begins with a P. But anyway, so even of them all, de la Barmondiere, who brings them there, I guess comes off the best. But here's Baudrin, who starts off anyway by being a spiritual director, and I think he dumps him, as a matter of fact. There's some evidence of that for Boheme when he goes to Vaugirard. But, and here's Baudrin, who's supposed to, and Blanc, of course, since Blanc, these are his teachers from Saint-Sulpice, and Blanc is always saying how wonderful they all are, and then he proceeds to tell us how terrible they are treating the founder. So Blanc is contradictory on this score too. But then when we come to Baudrin, Baudrin is giving the poor old founder a hard time right from the word go, beginning with the business on the habit. And then he opposes the novitiate, and he tries to move their house and their community, and then when the famine comes, he's not even willing to pay them their salary. And then he gives them advances and winds up by charging them for it. So and when we come to, we'll meet de la Chétardie this morning too, before we're finished, and he will become a major figure tomorrow, as we shall see. So and Chétardie remains the pastor from 1696 all the way to 1714, and it's probably maybe a factor in the founder's decision to return. But that's all. I'm getting like Blanc. That's all ahead of us. But I'm just suggesting that in the keeping the structure of this whole, or the sequence of these events in your own head, don't lose track of the relationships with the pastors of Saint-Sulpice. It's an extremely important element in the development of the Institute and in the response to the founder. Okay? All right, so with that in mind, we get the first conflict, the beginnings of the trouble with the schoolmasters in the Rue de Bac. And eventually the founder wins that case, probably through the intervention of some very influential people. And but if we look at page 80, 81, 82, and 83, Blanc's apologetic for this. Now, of course, this is interesting because this argument is still with us, isn't it? Or this discussion. What do we mean by the preferential option for the poor? What do we mean by the service of the poor? What do we mean by the direct and the indirect service and all that? Now, there's not much reference here to the indirect service, but Blanc, I think, is very contradictory in some of the things that he's trying to say. He starts off by saying, because in this context, the discussion is a legal one. Every pastor, as we have said over and over again, had the responsibility for the charity schools in his diocese. But it was understood that the charity schools were only for the poor and for the certified poor. So Blanc has paragraph after paragraph saying, oh, the kids of the brothers' school were surely poor. The schoolmasters had no right to be interfering with this because they were charging people, and these are people who couldn't pay. There weren't any other students. They were all poor. They were really poor. Then he has to admit, well, there were some who weren't poor. There were some who could afford to pay, etc., etc. And, but how do you know? Maybe they're really poor. Even some people who can afford to pay, maybe they really can't afford it. And isn't it embarrassing for them to have to be to admit that they're poor? And so who wants to say that they're poor? And so on and so forth. And so we find it winds up at the end of the thing with kind of pragmatic arguments and so on and so forth. So, and then he finally says, well, somehow or other the founder is right and everybody else is wrong. Of course, the other thing is the motives he imputes to the schoolmasters. All they're interested in is their money, you know. and so on and so forth. Well, rightfully, in the Rue de Bac, all of a sudden, here's this school open, and it's a better school than anything the schoolmaster is running, who has the title to that territory, and all of a sudden his best students are running over to the brother school, and they're getting a better education, and the parents are happy with it, and so on and so forth, and that word begins to get around. Of course, that was their livelihood. You can hardly blame them for an intrusion onto something that was fundamental to their own livelihood. But this, so Bland will come back to this question again and again and again as it arises. And it's one that the founder has to continually deal with. But he insisted on the absolute gratuity of the schools, absolute gratuity all the time, independently of the ability of the students or their parents to pay. Anybody want to say anything about that? So for example, Blant here talks about the poor as the destitute. Now, Poutet makes it very, very clear that the destitute were not coming to our schools. Where does he got that business about the destitute? Is it on 83? Oh, yes, yeah. Now, it should be kept in mind that the vocabulary, the poor were a real recognized social class made up of people who were actually destitute. Many of them had no fixed abode, they had no trade, so on and so forth. They lived largely by their wits. And Poutet would not agree with that at all. Poutet says that the really, really destitute, the vagabonds and so on, were either in the poorhouse or not in a stable parish and so on. So that's, he makes the point that the poor, in the founder's terms, tied in with the artisans, were those whose income was unstable. They were never sure from day to day and week to week that they would have enough to support themselves. And so they were from families where the father had to work, the mother had to work, the kids had to leave school and go to work at an early age, and so on and so forth. They were not the absolute downtrodden desperates, and so on and so forth. So Poutet certainly would disagree with Hernandez's footnote down at the bottom. That's Hernandez. Whereas Poutet has a very different thing. And then Blant has his explanation of going back and forth all the time. So you really have three different points of view right here on this page of who are the poor. Okay? Yes?
Were the writing masters and the schoolmasters the same group?
No, I explained that way in the beginning.
Yeah.
We had that already.
But I'm just finding
Just to refresh. The schoolmasters were those who were running an individual school all by themselves, a one-man schoolroom, or maybe with an assistant. The writing masters were a guild. The schoolmasters of a skilled guild of professional scribes. The writing masters were protected by the king. The schoolmasters were under the supervision of the diocesan supervisor, known as the écolatre. Okay? And keep that in mind. We'll make that very clear tomorrow when we look at the controversy. And they were at odds with each other, because the writing masters didn't want the schoolmasters teaching writing. Okay to teach reading, but not writing. But they finally gang up together against De La Salle, as we'll see. Anything else on that? Then it's interesting that here right away in 1690, 2 years after he's into Paris, and he brings two brothers with him, probably hand-picked to start this enterprise of the capital, and two of them leave. And one of them, a very good teacher, the other one hangs on a little bit longer and gets very insulting towards the founder, apparently even threatens to strike him, or actually strike him. I can't tell from what Bland says whether he actually swung back at the founder or something like that. In all of the fact that the founder imported somebody else to be the superior in the house. Bland doesn't say it, but it occurs to me that probably the person that the founder brought to Paris to be the superior was Henri Leroux, the one that the brothers in Reims had elected to be a successor, and assumed the superiorship briefly until the diocese got wind of it back in Reims. Because as we'll see, Henri Leroux is in Paris when he dies, and apparently he had covered by this time enough theology. If the founder started studying theology in Reims, he might have had enough to satisfy for ordination by the time 1690 comes along, and so the founder brings him to Paris to finish that up and prepare for his ordination. So I strongly suspect that the superior that the others resented so much was this kind of, this big shot, a man who for a time had been the superior of the society. And now he's their director all of a sudden, and they're not too happy with that. Okay?
If you wouldn't mind going back a little bit to 77.
All right.
When you mentioned in the beginning, the place talks about about
Campagnon,
yeah, and Villa
Barmondier.
and how he accepted all the accusations and about the charitable lady in particular. Bland says, we do not know what the malicious accusation actually was.
Yeah.
That's misleading and it goes on. Do you have any suspicions or comments?
My suspicion is it might have had something to do with corporal punishment. And that whole fracas that Bland relates earlier with regard to Reams, which seems to be a little dislocated, might have been part of the problem here when you grant what the situation was in the school that they had to try to correct. It's a guess. Gus, have you any? Yeah.
With regards to the women in the parish.
Yeah, it's the women, he gets the women all up in arms at this thing and so on. So that's the sort of thing that might appeal to some of the leading hearts.
Wouldn't corporal punishment have been quite popular there at that time?
Yes, I suppose it was, but the founder wasn't, was willing to allow it to be used when he thought it was necessary after everything else failed.
And why would these be up in arms again?
Well, maybe because in this parish it hadn't been used. It's pretty evident that they had no control over those kids. Huh? And how extensive it was, or whether that was considered appropriate, is something else. Every time I talk about Monsieur de la Barmondiere, I have to hesitate when I try to say it. Way back when I was a scholastic one time, we had reading during the meals. We were reading Battersby's Life of the Founder, and I was reading this story. And it was during World War II, and I referred to him without even thinking as Monsieur de la Bombardier. Andy O'Connor almost swallowed his meal whole. He let out an enormous yelp. Whoop! And then it took me a little while to realize what the problem was. So we got Gabe, you want to say something?
Well, I was just thinking, I thought maybe the women lost the authority and prestige with the founder coming there, because he probably kept the women at a distance from the brothers, and their influence was minimized by his being there. It probably was Champagnon had a lot of power before. So I just figured if I was a typical woman's guild or something, they would have retaliated this way.
I don't think they had much influence in running the place, though, but they were contributing. Of course, they had been contributing to the support of this thing when Champagnon was running it. So he had long been their benefactor, huh? And so it would be easy for him to get their ear. But I don't think it had much to do with any control that they had over the policies or anything like that. That they'll say, you know, here I've been doing this wonderful work all these years, and this character comes along and he's messing everything up. But as Blanc says, he had to have some rather specific charges to convince them and then to get the ear of the pastor. Although we shouldn't forget that these pastors had a very, very extensive parish that was the size of a diocese to administer. And so there's always two sides to these questions. The other side of it is, of course, is that they were happy with the brothers, but they didn't like De La Salle because I think that, again, like Letellier and Reams, they wanted this to be a parish society. They didn't want, we'll see more of that as we go on. Okay, I don't want to get too bogged down in it. So that takes care of where we were supposed to be at the end of yesterday. Okay, now let's take a look at this situation in Paris over this more or less 10-year period, the last decade of the 17th century. So here we are, the founder has had great hopes for the significance of moving to Paris, and after only 3 years, he's in real deep trouble. And so I think it's not an exaggeration to call this the crisis of 1691. We are exactly 300 years later after this year, so it's an appropriate year to be focusing on the crisis of 1691. Now, the first thing is his own illness. First of all, in Reims, after that long trip when he's exhausted and his grandmother comes to see him and he refuses to allow her upstairs, and she apparently is a little upset over that. But he comes downstairs and calms her down and says it's not that bad. He goes back to Paris, and then he gets terribly sick again, and this time it becomes very, very serious, and Blant indicates what the illness was, that he was unable to urinate. Now that's common enough, usually in older men, as some of us around here already know, and they did not have the remedies in those days, or the easily and relatively simple remedies that we have today for that type of a problem. But so they call in this Dutch doctor, whose name was Helvetius, who had earlier taken care of Louis Tronson, so the Sulpicians probably dragged him in. Baudrin maybe had something to do with calling him in. And so he proposed a remedy. Now, it's not clear to me what the remedy is. It sounds sometimes as if Blant is thinking some sort of a purgative or something taken internally that would release this blockage. Or it may have been an invasion from the outside, which you can imagine would be rather painful in those primitive circumstances before anything like anesthesia had been developed or any of that sort of thing. But at any rate, he warns the founder of the seriousness of the remedies about to apply and the chances that he probably might not survive. Old Baudrin probably was not too unhappy with this development. For all the pious stuff that's going on here, he gets all the priests in the parish and has a big, long, solemn administration of the sacrament of extreme unction, as it was then called, and a big dramatic scene with the brothers all around asking the founder for his blessing, and somebody has to hold up his hand and all that, and he was always reluctant to give his blessing anyhow, and so he receives viaticum, and the founder was always fussy about the requirement that when priests are involved in the reception of sacraments, they always wear the surplice in the stole. So here he is. Somehow they got those vestments on him, received viaticum, and then the doctor went to work. Whatever he did and stayed with him, and apparently the remedy was successful, and the founder recovered. But again, here was an event. Now at this point, he's only 40 years old. And he has to begin to think, well, you know, he's not going to live forever. And he came awfully, awfully close to going to his eternal reward. So that created some reason for thinking. Then all of a sudden he gets news of what's going on in Reims. He had left behind 16 brothers in charge of another brother, Henri, not Henri Leroux, but another brother, Henry, who was, again, young, inexperienced, very rigid and very tough on the brothers, and so 8 of the 16 left, and only 1 or 2 new ones had come in. So here the institute is cut in half already, down to 8 brothers in that center in Reims. And of course, then meanwhile also, the junior is drying up, and candidates aren't coming to that, and the school for country schoolmasters. Now, of course, Blant attributes all this to the devil. The reason why the school for the training teacher of the country schoolmasters folded up was that after 1 or 2 years, it's something like the Buttimer, you run out of a clientele. All of these pastors got their school teachers back, and so every pastor had now a trained school teacher from De La Salle, so there weren't any more to send. This happened to our theology program in Manhattan, and I suppose eventually it will happen to the Buttimer. After a while, everybody will have made it. Let's hope. From what I hear at the moment anyway, the plan is to run another Buttimer one next year and announce that it will be the very last way of doing it in this format. So it's not too surprising that the country schoolmasters thing collapsed. But the whole situation back in Reims is falling apart. Then, of course, the biggest blow of all is when the founder is up in Reims after he recovers. Here's old Henri Leroux, and he's up in Reims, and he hears that he's sick. Well, he thinks, oh, he's a strong man, not to get too excited. Then another message coming and saying he's very, very sick, and it's crucial. And then the founder realizes that he'd better get back there. When he gets back to Paris, he finds that poor old Henri Leroux has already been dead and buried by a couple of days. So so all of a sudden it looks like everything's collapsing around him. He's had a warning in what happened to his own health and his near death. The situation in Reims is deteriorating rapidly, and his major, the keystone of his plan to have a brother replace him and to have a brother ordained to replace him so that there won't be the problem of an ecclesiastical superior and so on with the higher authorities. Oh, all of a sudden, all of the principal elements of his plan are falling apart and collapsing. And then in the middle of all of this, his grandmother dies, huh? The one that he was very fond of and the one that supported him most of all, Perrette l'Espagnole, the mother of his mother. So this situation is a real crisis. And then meanwhile, of course, he's having all of these troubles back in the parish with the pastor, who's trying to get a stronghold on the Institute and who's opposing all of De La Salle's own plans for the direction in which he thinks God wants the Institute to go. So it is a real crisis. So as Bland puts it, he decides that the more he looks around, he begins to think about, why are we losing so many brothers? Some through death and some through loss of their vocation. Well, he figures that's because they weren't given enough training, huh? And that's because we don't have a place where when they get sick, where they can recover their health. So the first thing he sees is the need for a place, a center, whereby that could serve as a training center and a place that could also serve as a place of rest and repose and recuperation for those who are sick. And really, it's a two-point plan. Find a place that would remedy those things. And the other part of the plan, of course, was to provide for a succession. So he looks around and he tries to make judgments about the men available, and he finally settles on Gabriel Drolin and Nicolas Guillard to get the three of them together to say, this thing is falling apart. We've got to put it back together again. So let's together see what we can do with this. So, yes?
Just a matter of dating. In the beginning, they give 1690 as the year for all this happening.
Yes, well, don't go too strongly by the chronology in beginnings. Loes himself has revised a good bit of that, all right? And that was the best thing that was available back in 1980 when I did it, but I think that I'm surprised, to tell you the truth, that 1690 is the date there for all of that. Some of it, of course, was in 1690. In 1690, that's when the controversy with the schoolmasters and the memoir of the habit and all.
This is his illness and
His
going
illness,
back to Reims.
Yeah.
That should be 691 though.
Oh, well, the illness. The 90 might be the right date for the illness. I just can't be sure offhand. Gus, can you help me on this?
I think what you're saying is correct. There's a period going through from middle of 1690 into the middle of 1691.
Yeah, I think, it crosses that year. That's a good way to get out of the difficulty, I guess, yeah. And the illness is nowhere, it's not dated anyway, huh? So that has to be some kind of a guess. Except in terms of going backwards. That would, by the time he gets to Vaugirard, and then by that time he would have had to have recovered, etc. So probably the illness would be 1690. But the crisis, if we put this all under the crisis of 1691, it's all building up, as a crisis does. So I guess that's the way to explain it. All right. So the first thing is to get the place. And so he has this, but in no way does Baudrin want him to set up a novitiate, a training center. Why? Well, first of all, it would get him out of the center of the parish. It would give him an opportunity to begin to look like the founder of a religious congregation that would not be dependent on the pastor of the parish. So Baudrin was looking after his own interests. He was perfectly happy to have the brothers and even De La Salle with them to have the best school in town there in the Rue Princesse, and the other one on the Rue de Bac. But then all of a sudden to have this founder begin to think about, well, locating way the hell out of town, a center where he would be in total control all by himself, away from the pastor, away from the control of the parish, and set up an independent operation that he would not have total control of. It's easy to understand his objection. And of course, so the founder, of course, Bland is great. Here's the humorous thing on the part of Baudrin. The founder is macerating himself and trying to bargain with God and all that sort of stuff. And Baudrin says he can beat himself to death if he wants to, but he's not going to change my mind. Huh? So what does the founder do? Very interestingly, he's enough of a shrewd ecclesiastical politician. He goes over the pastor's head to the Archbishop de Harlay, and he gets the Archbishop's okay to set up this training center, or novitiate, if you want to call it that. I think Blount is anticipating canonical category. So he gets the Archbishop's approval to set up this center. And so he gets around it that way, which could not have made the pastor very happy either. Huh? When that's done in ecclesiastical circles, you may win the battle, but you often lose the war. Last night when we were talking about all that business of the scourging and the beatings and the disciplines and all that sort of stuff, it occurred to me, and I think this is kind of a theological language that we've developed recently, is that not only says something about the spirituality of the times, of course it does, but when we think of spirituality, we're thinking of the spiritual practices that people have. But it also says something about the theology of the time. And that really is, this implies a certain view of God. And even a certain view, Gus and I were talking about this the other day, of what redemption means. The notion that you can bargain with God, and the best bargaining chip you have is suffering. Huh? That if the more you suffer, huh? That this is what God demands. You see this every once in a while. Huh? And so God demands the sacrifice of Henri Leroux, for example. And he interprets it because the founder's life was saved, so God wants somebody else as a victim. Huh? There's a lot of that. That occurs in the life of Miguel, by the way, one time. The Blessed Sacrament was profaned in one of the schools where they were, and the director of the house, God held him responsible, and he died the next week. God was getting even for that. So there's a theology here, huh? What kind of a God is your God? And it's the older approaches to the theology of redemption, that because of all of these terrible sins, somebody had to make up for it with all the suffering. Huh? So Jesus is up at the cross and he says, I've been here an hour. Is that enough? Heavenly Father? The Heavenly Father says, no, stay there another hour. Is that enough now? No, so make it 3 hours. And by the way, goodbye. I'm going to abandon you. Why have you abandoned me? That type of quid pro quo sort of thing, of bargaining with God and trying to buy things from God by, well, it's a theology as well as a spirituality that's involved here. I think you ought to keep that in mind. So what kind of a God are we involved in? Which still leaves, of course, the whole problem of suffering self-inflicted, suffering that we have to inevitably accept, and the suffering that's built into human existence, which is another theological consideration, and another consideration for spirituality too. But we can't get too deep into the theology thing, but that occurred to me as a way of reflecting about what's going on here every time the founder feels that he has to use this means to win from God what he wants, and Blount's way of interpreting it besides. Okay, so that's so now this whole thing is in process, and we are at Vaugirard. Now, so Vaugirard, it's interesting to see what's going on at Vaugirard. The first thing, of course, at Vaugirard is the priority was, now he gets there, and as soon as vacation time comes in September, the priority was to get all of those brothers who had no formation whatsoever, most of them now had been in the schools for a while, to bring them there for a retreat during the vacation time. So in a certain sense, this was a renewal program, or in some of our modern terminology, a second novitiate. He has a second novitiate before he had a first novitiate. He had a juniorate before he had anything, so he starts with the juniorate, then he has a second novitiate, and he finally gets around to a novitiate. So that was the first thing. So he brings all these brothers in during vacation time, the whole Reims crowd and the Paris crowd. There's 2 centers now. And the thing everything is going so well, but as Blanc says, the 10 days were barely enough to whet their appetites to get them to see, or maybe to get the founder to see what it was they really needed. So he arranged to have lay substitutes in the schools in Reims, and using some of those country schoolmasters to somehow keep the schools going, and so he kept them there for another couple of months. All right? And he finally became convinced of the necessity that they really be given an intensive period of spiritual formation, and perhaps even some bit of academic formation too, about especially motivation for what they were doing in the schools. So, and from then on, he begins to see the necessity for bringing them together regularly for this. And the founder keeps every chance he gets, he restores this practice of bringing all the community brothers, all of those in the Paris area, as you read. They finally had to come, once they went back to school, they had to come back to Vaugirard on weekends and during holiday times. So they pile right out of school and hoof it up to the novitiate and get right into the swing of the novitiate routine and live with the novices and under De La Salle's direction. And that went on for a couple of years. And the ones in Reims who couldn't get down there on weekends and so on, well, then you bring them all down at vacation time. He set up a similar program when when his final novitiate gets settled in Rouen. So then he begins to develop, once that program is settled, in November, he gets hold of Vuillard and Rollin, and the three of them, in the face of all of the problems that they're having, and wondering whether this thing is going to survive, and seeing the importance of it, the three of them make the heroic vow. And Blanc gives us the text. We want to take a look at that heroic vow. I suppose we should, since it's since we're in the anniversary. What page is it on? 101. Now, the opening paragraph is the one that's still used today. The address to the Trinity: we consecrate ourselves entirely to you. Now, why? The first paragraph is different in this first one from what we use today, of course. To procure, with all our ability and efforts, the establishment of the society of the Christian schools in a manner which will seem to us most agreeable to you and advantageous to this society. Notice Brother Augustine is concerned about institute, its society here at this point. Wonder if that doesn't have some reference to canonical language. Might think about that.
I really don't know, that's why I've asked Leonard Barnes to investigate.
Yeah, but he'd have to look at the canonical usage of these various terms too, because pious associations, for example, and pious societies, there were so many of those and I think the founder didn't want to have it in order, and society was too general, perhaps, as community would have been too. So there may be something to that. So for this purpose, he names himself, and he always calls himself priest. De La Salle always was clearly conscious of the fact that he was different from the brothers. Even maybe a little snooty with regard to the social gap. He couldn't abandon his own upbringing and his social status, but certainly he never abandoned his concept of being a priest. And then Vuillard and Rollin, from now on and forever, until the last surviving one of us. This is where the heroicity comes, I suppose. Or one or the other. It's something like one of those warranties that you get, for an automobile. 5,000 miles, 50,000 miles, or 3 years, whichever comes first. So from now on or forever, until the last surviving one of us, or until the complete establishment of the said society, which is another reason why it's a process, because they're not thinking of the society as established yet. We make the vow of association and union. So the vow this time is a vow of association and union to bring about maintain the establishment without being able to withdraw from this obligation, even if only we three remain, and if we're obliged to beg for alms and live on bread alone. In view of which we promise to do, all together and by common accord, everything we shall think in conscience, and regardless of any human consideration, to be for the greater good of the said society. So that's the first vow. It's a vow to associate together to get this thing established. Now, in all of his writing, I have a thing on Blount about vows, because he's writing after the Bull of Approbation has been approved. He's thinking like a canonist and a canon lawyer and an ecclesiastic, and he's talking about religious orders and solemn vows, and he's got all those categories in his head, and he is not looking at the reality of the founders' development with the brothers. The first private vow in 1686 was a vow to obey the superior, to give stability to this enterprise. Nothing in there about becoming a religious order. And this time it's a vow of association, which is at the center of the whole thing. And it's the only thing that's here in this vow. Okay? So that's the heroic vow. All right? So, all right, now we've got at Vaugirard. Then the next thing on the agenda is the novitiate. So he gets the novitiate going, and it's very interesting what he says about the novitiate. First of all, I guess we can, in spite of what Reyes was saying, I suspect some of the descriptions of the penances and so on are a little bit exaggerated, but it was a very penitential existence, probably, that's for sure, with the novices, and the schedule was set up, which I think became the regular pattern of the schedule of the novitiates that we've had ever since. But he mentions that in spite of all of that, in spite of the freezing cold and everything else, and going to bed with frozen underwear in the winter and all those lovely details, so on and so forth, none of them ever got sick. Yeah? So it's kind of interesting. Aren't the statistics interesting on the recruits? He was getting 5 solid novices every year, pretty much on the average. Huh? Over this 6 or 7 year period, 35 persevered out of about 300 who came and went and so on and so forth. But boy, wouldn't we be happy if we had 5 novices a year. Last year we didn't have a single one in the whole United States. Huh? And next year we'll have 5 or 6 in the novitiate to cover 8 or 9 provinces. So, there you are. But and he makes the point too that this attracted a very large number of quality candidates. It attracted a fair number of fly-by-night people too, of course. We've always had those in the novitiate. In the old Barrytown novitiate, when I think in our group that I think something more than 50 came into the novitiate the year I entered the novitiate in 1940. There were 35 from the juniorate, and about something like 17 came in from outside, as I did. But some of those who came in from outside barely stayed overnight. Now they took one look at the place and realized this is not for me. The recruiter had been giving perhaps too much of a glowing description of the marvelous location on the banks of the Hudson River. You could spit into the river. Well, you'd have to be a pretty good spit if you wanted to make it. So this has always been the problem in the case, I guess. I have a lot of comments I could make about this, especially about the junior, but I was really distressed because I guess I really wanted to go to the junior myself. It was probably the influence of Brother Augustine in freshman year, but it was a big family, it was the Depression and so on, so the old man said, nothing doing, you've got to stay, you've got to help support this family, so I had to go to work for a couple of years. I worked in sweatshops mostly, that's where I got all of my barracks vocabulary, let's say. And after 2 years of that, I found people were getting married all around me, and I figured, well, boy, this is looking more and more attractive all the time. I finally said to the old man, I think I really want to be a brother, but it's either now or never, another year of this, and I don't think there's going to be much left of my interest. So, okay, he says, go ahead. So we go to there, after this struggle, sort of, and resistance, not only with my father, but the brothers. Good grief. In first year, the recruiter came around, and inspired by Brother Augustine and so on, write down what you want to be. So I wrote down brother. Wasn't even called in for an interview. the monks must have got the word to him, oh, God, don't pay attention to that character. That's one of the reasons I made the points I made last night. That was partially autobiographical. The second year comes around, right down, brother. So this time I had an interview, and when he heard that my parents didn't understand this at all and so on, well, then the recruiter lost interest, and towards the end of the year, the homeroom teacher calls me up and he says, hey, Salm, he says, I hear you want to be a brother. Oh, he says, I hope you don't have as terrible and a discouraging year as I had this year. He started hinting to me that everything was terrible and it was a mess. I thought it was the best year of my whole life, and our class was successful and all that sort of stuff. But he didn't like the class. He left the institute shortly after John Benton. And third year, we had a real character for the homeroom teacher, thin old man, with a marvelous mathematician. His name was Austin. We used to call him Husky Austin because he was so skinny. The brothers had another name for him, Jerry Two-Bits. So Two-Bits calls me up. Hey, Salm, he says, I hear you want to go to Barrytown and be a brother. He says, ha ha, he said, you wouldn't last 2 weeks. So that's the story of my vocation. When I finally got to the novitiate, here were these 35 kids from the small, and I said to myself, wouldn't it be great finally to be with a bunch of fellows of my own age, more or less, all of whom are gung-ho to be brothers. And so we go out to recreation, and I was very enthusiastic about CBA, lovely the school I had gone to. So in the first recreation, we're out there, and we discussed the book, as Gus said, and then somebody said, now, postulant Salm, what do you want to have something to say? Oh, I said, I just like the idea of being a brother. I came from this wonderful school, and I started talking about some of the things that were going on at CBA. And so the monitor says, dear brother postulant, the holy rule says you will not talk about the place you have been or the place you have come from, and so on and so forth. So I was shut up very, very properly. And then the bastards all started talking about what they had been doing in the small novitiate. Then for the rest of the postulancy, they were dropping off like flies. They were all going around crying and weeping and gnashing their teeth and, oh, this is terrible. And this manual labor, we can't talk. I said, you guys don't know what manual labor is. I work for 8 hours a day for 27 cents an hour, for crying out loud. To have only 2 hours and in the outdoors in the fresh air, this is great. So they thought I was strange. Wasting time, but anyway. So I always think lovingly of Lozier art and the success of those 35 who stay. Interesting too. It's interesting that De La Salle seemed always to have a thing with the holy priests or priests who were interested in somehow sharing a little bit in the austerity and the type of life. Again, I think part of the spirituality of the times, huh? And so he had this priest come from Law to live with him for a while, and then he had this, and then a count, of course, the layman again, going to the Trappist every year, and then suddenly realized that he had something similar in his backyard, and then Bowen and the Sulpicians had a minor seminary nearby. That lovely story about Bowen coming with his seminarians and De La Salle with his brothers, and the two of them saying Mass and distributing communion. And then, of course, Blam makes the judgment. But of the two of them, it was clear that De La Salle did a better job. He was even more holy and more recollected than the other one. Kind of funny. And then Bowen coming there to give the founder spiritual direction and waiting outside for him and so on. So this is what leads me to think that at this point, De La Salle was no longer using Baudrin as his permanent spiritual director, but probably using Bowen. In 1693, you have that famine where he has to move them back to Paris and so on. And then that son of a gun, Baudrin, by the way, his name sometimes is spelt with a D at the end and sometimes not. Hernandez leaves off the D. I forget now whether it's in Bland's original French. You'll see it both ways. Same with same with the spellings of we are, for example. So and old Baudrin is not very helpful to them during the famine of 1693 when they have to go back into Paris and he's holding back the money and all that. I don't think there's anything to comment about the fact except to notice it. Is there anything about that now? About the Vaugirard thing that anybody wants to bring up? Were most of you able to get through this reading, by the way? Is that a nasty question to ask? More or less? As I said, you know, I think, as Gus presumes you read the letters, I have to presume you're reading Blanc, and I can speed through some of this stuff and just bring out some things to highlight. But I'm perfectly willing to halt if some of you want to bring out some things to highlight. Okay, Frank?
On page 102 here, about 15 lines or so from the top, Blaine says, "For one of the two later became a new Judas."
Yeah.
Who does Blaine think he is?
Oh, well, we'll delay on that a little bit when if that's mild compared to what he ultimately says if you've read the rest of it. Huh? You know, he's talking about we are, of course.
The place of Bori, Vaugirard, I mean, it seems like it's like an abandoned farm.
Something like that, I guess. Yeah. But apparently, it had a lot of space around it. The found it was great on fresh air and all
I mean,
that.
no windows and.
Well, you have to, I suspect Bland never saw it. I'm sure. Well, maybe he did because he was in Paris in 1693, and he was in Saint-Sulpice. He might have been out there with Boheme, so he might have seen the thing.
Even like saying that you lived through the winter in that section of France, and with snow coming in and covering the blankets. I mean, it just doesn't seem possible.
Doesn't. No, and of course, we're so used to central heating and all that sort of stuff. I was amazed my first time I went to Europe, even in England, for example, where they didn't have central heating in any of the houses. And the older ones had fireplaces. The new thing was to have electric heaters in there, which you could put on if you wanted, but they pile themselves up with blankets and all that sort of stuff. But the monks in England in some of those houses, and I was there at Christmas time, the house was freezing, compared to what I was used to. And they were getting up in the morning. There was no running hot water, but taking showers, cold showers. Getting out of one of those beds in the dead of winter. And so the same thing with the mother house. I think Brother Augustine, I know Charles Henry, the experience they had in the mother house in 46, 47, when there was no heat there all winter long, it was just expected that you could keep moving or wrap yourself up in a robe or, but I suspect there's a fair amount of exaggeration here too. And don't forget, it doesn't snow all winter long in those countries either.
Talk about Vaugirard. The quality of the recruits come to mind. In the very beginning, those who came, about 10 years before this or something like that, in Reims, the first recruits as brothers were not very good quality, as it were. Now here there's a kind of a change. So over a period of these 10 years, the kind of young men who came to join the brothers were different.
No, but
say something along that line?
No, but if you remember back in Reims, the first group of 6 or so, most of them left. But Bland tells us that the next group that came along were of much better quality. And if you remember the story about the 3 brothers who died, young and all that sort of stuff, a couple of them were from fairly good, well-to-do
Well, that's
families.
what struck me too, that they were high bred and all that kind of stuff.
And when Gus gets his book out on all of those early brothers, we'll get even a better insight into this. But as we'll see here in this narrative, people like Rollin had some kind of education beforehand, Bartholomew, and so there were a fair number of that type coming in anyhow, that had some kind of, yeah, Peter?
On page 96, I find the last commentary on the priesthood question. It was like he really gave them jabs.
Yeah. I have a remark on that too. And I'm saying this again, I think I've put next to it Bland's autobiography again. I mean, he's talking about his own sense of his own dignity as a priest here when he goes off on things like this. A little later on, though, he has an interesting description of a brother's vocation, and I'll try to point that out when we get to it.
You see it more as talking about his dignity as a priest?
Yes, I think so.
He's taking pot shots at priestly time.
Yeah, oh yeah, sure, because this was one of his jobs.
Oh.
Okay, he was put in charge of a minor seminary for a while, and he had an awful time with a lot of them. And of course, the Jansenism was all over the place and so on and so forth.
What was Baudrin's basic reason for not wanting an officiate Beaujolais? Was it that he would lose control, like they were trying to get him lean over the brothers in a local area?
I'm sorry, I lost the first part.
You know, Baudrin, is that the saying that he
Yeah.
did not want an officiate Beaujolais?
Yeah, right. He didn't want an novitiate at all.
Why?
Well, that's why he tries to suggest that this would be the foundation of an independent group over which he as pastor would have no control. The beginning almost of an order that would transcend the parish and the diocese and everything. And I think Baudrin's plan in his own mind was, fine, we got this terrific group with this leader who has a lot of sense and holds them together and so on, and now this is just going to become a permanent feature of the parish of Saint-Sulpice.
That's the same thing like Lasallian.
Same exact thing as Letellier, exactly. And we'll see towards the end that when the founder is down in the south, they actually try to rewrite the rule in such wise that everything else will be closed except the parish of Saint-Sulpice. That the institute would become a parochial institute. All right. Now let's take a look then at the famous chapter of 1694. I think I mentioned one time earlier in the beginning when this stuff wasn't so fresh in my mind, that the first general chapter is considered to be 1617. That's not 1717. That's not correct. In the official list, this is considered the first general chapter, 1694. The first, and we count from there. I wonder why I've often wondered why they never counted 1686. It may have been that when they started the count, and I don't know when they began numbering them, they skipped the other one because there was no change in the superior, no election of a superior. But there was, of course, but it didn't last. But this time they formally elected de La Salle to be their superior. And also it may be that that this is the first time they made perpetual vows. So some of those reasons may have led them not to take the 1686 one quite so seriously, although I think it would deserve to be so. But at any rate, so 1694 is this general chapter. The first item on the agenda is the rules. And so we know that there was already a list of regulations that had been a kind of daily coutumier, a reglement that had been circulated and so on. The first text of the rule that we have that has survived, the manuscript, is 1705, 10 years later than this. But that probably reflects pretty much the rule that was put together here in 1694. And the rule emerged out of the experience of the brothers. And with consultation with the founder certainly exercising a leadership role. There are ways of leading people to think that they're more involved than they actually are. But that's one side of it, but there's no question that the other side was based on their experience, and the founder certainly adjusted his own thinking to what they thought of their experience and putting in things they thought should be there and taking out things that should not. So out of this we get the first common rule of the Institute. And so this was the first thing that had to be approved. Gus, you looked like you wanted to say something about that, didn't you? Now, as we'll see, these are subject to revision again, and a couple of very significant revisions in 1717. I'm writing a book about the last three general chapters. And the next thing that I finished writing up the chapter of 1966-67, and I have a long section there about the genesis of the new rule that was put together in 1966. 67 in that chapter, that 39th general chapter. And the next thing that I have to address in this history is why we left that chapter full of excitement and elation and everything else, and thereafter the whole thing began to fall apart. And the question of why, what happened after 67? And why didn't the new rule, the rule which is new at that time, which is the basis of the rule we have at the present time, why didn't that grab hold of the brothers? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but I've been asking myself whether or not the rule we now have was as based on the experience of the brothers as the original rule of the founder. And the problem, of course, was that by the time we got to 1966, this rule of 1705 and 1717, the rule, talk about the manuscripts, but if you want, the rule of 1694, which then was revised somewhat in 1717, that rule came out of the experience of the brothers. This reflected their lived experience. By the time we got to 1947, with the same text, it was completely at odds with the experience of the brothers. And so in creating a whole new thing, I think the new rule really came out of the Declaration. Now, to what extent did that come out of the experience of the brothers? It did, in a way, as represented by the general chapter. But the rule that finally came out, and for 10 years previously, that had been sent all around the Institute to the visitors and their councils to try to create a new rule using somewhat the same process that the founder did. But then when we got to the general chapter, that proved to be so built into the mentality prior to Vatican II. All of a sudden with Vatican II, we have a new climate and a new lived experience and everything new floating around all over the place. And to try so quickly to encapsulate that into a text may be some of the problems. So I haven't resolved that in my own mind. Did the 67 rule reflect the 1717 rule certainly did not reflect the lived experience of the brothers anymore. And did the 67 rule reflect the experience of the brothers? And to what extent did it? It's an interesting question.
In addition to those considerations, which are, I think, are very good, we do not also have to factor into that all of what else was going on in everybody's life at that time.
Yes, of
I
course.
think that had a lot of.
Yeah, that's a very good point too, because, for example, the novices in Barrytown were told, another brother and myself as delegates to the chapter, before we went to the novitiate, the director of novices told them that it was a waste of money to send anybody to Rome for the general chapter because the Institute no longer had anything to say to the brothers. And after the thing was over, we went to the Scholastic in Washington, practically got laughed out of the hall trying to say something positive about one of it. So that was rampant and pervasive custom.
Yeah. One of the aspects of contemporary thought was the rejection of institutions.
Yeah.
And in a sense, among the young, rejection of authority. The only authority is, I remember talking to Scholastic in the Mission and just for the discussion saying to him, well, you want to be following the truth, don't you? He said, yes, Brother Director. What is the truth as I see it?
Yeah. Well, but it's an interesting thing. Again, how much of the 17th century experience is translatable and transportable into our own situation. One more, Steve, and then we'll go to coffee.
Yeah, I think the rule of 67, at least compared to the rule of 47, certainly reflects experience of brothers, but there's a factor in there that didn't have to be contended with here much earlier, and that was diversity of various cultures and the experience of the spirituality and everything among different cultures. By the time the rule of 67 got approved in 86 or whatever the year that was, last chapter, there are shades of it perhaps that in various cultures that we might not consider our experience, but I think in general it seems to me that it certainly reflects the declarations, which certainly reflected the experience of the brothers, particularly in the United States and Canada and some places where I think
France,
it's
sir?
very active.
Yeah, well, it's something interesting to think about. And maybe
May
we
I
could
ask
say
one
something.
question?
Yes.
How many of the brothers in this room read the rule every day? Raise your hand.
We read as a community, as for the person.
I'm thinking of your own personal concern about the rule as the principal interpretation of the gospel for you and your vocation. I think we're not inclined to that kind of life. Being guided
Yeah.
by.
But that's an extreme example. You know, I had a lot to do with that rule, and I don't read it every day either. I know it by heart. But don't you think the brothers are discovering that rule that we
I
have?
hope so, but I mean.
It's used a lot in prayer services, and
I mean that if it is what it's supposed to be, we'd be reading it, not every day, very frequently, and meditating on it, and we're not doing it.
oh, well, I think that is that. I think people are reading it and meditating on it, but not every day, and not always personally.
I say it every day.
But if you, I mean, if there's another way to be concerned about the rule in our life, other than reading it every day, I just believe that most of I would think.
How many think the text of the rule has something to say to the brothers today? Yeah, and how many contact it from time to time? Let's ask that question. You get a slightly different thing. Peter, let's go to coffee and bring it up to you. Coming prepared for tomorrow. I suppose we have to try to be a little bit realistic about this. What to do about the 150 pages. Especially since you have a 4 o'clock session this afternoon, huh? And a party tonight. So here's what I suggest. Try to find some time between today and tomorrow to tackle this assignment of 150 pages. And if you haven't got a head start on it already, I think it's practically impossible to read 150 pages in the time that's there. So suppose I suggest this. Read the headings of the chapters. That'll at least give you an idea of the sequence, because his chapter headings are fair. You'll at least have a synopsis. You'll have some idea of what I'm talking about. Right? And then tomorrow in the presentation, I'll try to be a little fuller and to bring the book with you to highlight some of the places in the text that I think need attention. And I have a schema prepared on that conflict with the writing masters and the schoolmasters. And then over the weekend, go back and read the text, because you really have to read Beland's account of this thing to get a feel for it. And so suppose we do that. I won't presume that you've read the whole thing when we come here tomorrow. Chris?
I have a suggestion. I don't know if anybody's planning it being the early afternoon of tomorrow, but what if we had the 2-hour sessions, one just before lunch, one right after lunch, and do the morning for reading? We'd be finished by, if we got back here at 1, by 2 o'clock. Is there any appetite for that?
It's a tough time. That's my nap time, and I wouldn't want to fall asleep in the middle of the second lecture. Gabe?
I was thinking of that 4 o'clock session today. Is there any possibility?
That's stubborn.
Do it my way.
All right, now, the next thing at this chapter was the rules out of the way. We could discuss endlessly about the whole rule thing, and I think that maybe triggered some interesting things for you to reflect on. We come now to the business of vows. Somebody's looking for an interesting project, by the way, would be to trace the actual text of the vow formula, the heroic vow in 1674 and the present one, and to compare that with what Bland has to say about vows, et cetera, et cetera. That might be some interest. Yes, sir.
Before we move on, I'd like to make a comment.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Go about the rule, because it seems to me that, when the first rule was prepared by Lasallian, he first was a singular author. Given to the brother's experiences, and he passed it around and let other people read it and everything. If you were dealing with fewer people who had a more common experience, and so when Lasallian wrote the rule, it was easier, I think, for them to have agreement on it. I think they also shared a common set of values. I think by the time 1966 rolled around, and they're revising the rule, the institute is much larger. People come from very cultures, I think have different sets of cultural values. And then there's a lot of negotiating and interest groups are trying to, flex their muscle to get into the rule that they want, the rule that's one.
Well, sure, that's exactly why the 47 rule, which was basically the same as the 1718 rule, became totally out of tune with the experience of the brothers, because it arose out of a 17th century French thing where it worked, but it wouldn't work in every country in the world. Getting up at 4:30 in the morning is a simple example, or not crossing your legs and all, and any number of other things. Another factor that, of course, this gets terribly complicated, but parallel to the rule, the development of the rule, they began to develop this enormous thing called the Book of Government, which was an administrative structural thing, and then the codification of canon law in 1917. And then finally, by the time we got to 1966, well, then we had a rule, then we had constitutions, and then we had a Book of Government, and then all of a sudden the Vatican comes along and says you have to do the whole thing differently, and incorporated all of that into one volume. So the complexity of putting a rule together, the problems were enormous.
I guess in response to what Gus was saying, whether you what the rule is, well, it seems to me, Gus, that the rule is a compromise document put together by these various interest groups.
I don't think of it that way. That's not what we were trying to do. What we're trying to do with the rule, now we really can't spend too much time on it. What we're trying to do with the rule was to capture, as the Declaration tried to do, the essence of our vocation, to hold on to those fundamental things that came from the founder. I tell people that if you read chapter 1 of the present rule, you've got the whole thing. You don't need anything else. It's all there. Spirit of faith, spirit of zeal, community, the name brother, the ways of maintaining the spirit of faith, how zeal is expressed, the priority of the schools, the service of the poor, open to other things, and the last article that says we have to integrate consecration, community, and apostolic ministry. And that there, it's all in that first chapter, and that's right, still identical with the founder. All the rest of it is simply taking those things and developing them, and our hope was that they could be completely adaptable in any culture. And I don't think there's very much there by way of interest groups. A little bit of problem with some of the stuff to keep the Vatican happy and things like that. But to talk about the rule, I need a week. And, I do retreats on the rule sometimes. So, Gus?
I'm just going to say that the original rule is filled with very many details and a lot of minutiae. It's very concrete. The present rule has very little detail and minutiae. It's a statement of ideals. That's a very great difference between the rule of 47 and
It's an attempt to define our vocation. That's really the way to look at the rule. And as such, I don't really think of it as a compromise document, though. I think it was a totally different approach. Now let's get to the vows. All right, and so, well, if you've read this, you know how the founder went around, and apparently he got the 12, now here's where the 12 principal brothers come. By this time it would have been a more select group. And he interviews them one by one. This whole issue was on hold since 1686, where they all made a private vow of obedience and presumably kept renewing it, or some of them did, and some of them didn't. So here he takes this group of 12 and asks them what he thinks. Now remember, not everybody is making these vows. And then when they finally kind of agree on what the vows are going to be, then they go to a private room. Now this will give you some idea of how big the house must have been, huh? If the founder could get these 12 men off to a corner someplace and have them do something as solemn as make perpetual vows and not have the rest of the house know about it, which is an interesting thing because he wasn't sure how ready the rest of them would be for this type of event. So that's an interesting development too. So out of this we get the formula, which is the basis for the formula of vows. Now Bland doesn't give the text of this as he does for the heroic vow. So what Bland has failed to do, I will supply the lack. Because I think we ought to take a look at this. Again, in terms of what I've been saying about the function of vows, this text is basic. because now the Institute apparently is stable enough for them to consider that the vow of the heroic vow has been realized by this time. And so it begins the same way with the address to the Trinity. By the way, in the English text of the present rule, you have the first paragraph is the same translation that we used in 1967 when Brother Gustin and I translated the 1967 rule into English, or supervised and edited the translation. And we left out the adorable. At that time, we thought that to call God adorable, well, you know, you think of your little nieces and nephews, and isn't she adorable and all that sort of thing. And we felt that in English, it didn't say much, and it could be well left out, that it was included in infinite. And I meant to put it back in again, because I was in charge of the English translation of the new rule, and I was going to put the word awesome in there, before your infinite and awesome majesty. In a way, I'm glad I didn't, because that has become such a cliche with the younger ones. I think it originated out here in California. Everything is awesome. Oh, that's awesome. Although in this context, I think it would fit, and that might be, it belongs in there. So anyway, if you use the text of the English rule, that word is missing. But anyway, notice what he's doing this time. I consecrate myself entirely to you to procure your glory. Now, this time it's not specific. As far as I am able, and as you will require of me. And for this purpose, I, John Baptist de La Salle, priest. Each one of them made the vow separately, apparently, and each one put in his own name. Now notice this. Promise and vow to unite myself. So the vows are already being pronounced in the second paragraph. The word vow was dropped from this paragraph at the turn of the century, but it was in there up until about 1900. So what are they vowing? They're vowing I vow to unite myself and to remain in the society with these others, and to keep together, by association, gratuitous schools. So that's the vow. The vow is to be united in association and to stay with it, to remain. Even if I were obliged to live on bread alone, that dropped out somewhere time after the founder's death. Or to do anything in the said society at which I shall be employed, whether by the body or the superior. A vow to do what the body of the society says, which of course will become important in the founder's own life. When they challenge him, you've made this vow to obey the body of the society. And the body of the society comes before the superiors. They're tremendously innovative elements here. And then he comes to, wherefore I promise and vow obedience to the body of the society. And here's where the obedience, the original vow, comes in explicitly mentioned at this point, although it's implicit in the previous paragraph. Which vows of association and stability and of obedience I promise to keep. All right, so that's a kind of a recapitulation of everything that's gone before. Now, we had a terrible fight over this in the 1986 chapter. It was the only really disputed question, I suppose, that came up with the whole rule, and the chapter was just about split evenly in two on the question. Because the draft that we had proposed for that middle paragraph was to say, remain in the society with the brothers of the Christian schools who are associated to keep together, to work together for the educational ministry, especially for the poor. And all of a sudden, the French came yelling and screaming, "Où sont les jeunes? Où sont les écoles? Where are the schools? What happened to the schools?" Well, we said, not everybody teaches in school anymore. No, we have the schools. That's originally here. Well, we finally agreed to put the schools back in. I should have duplicated the text of the present rule so you can compare it. I suggest you do it yourself. When you begin your daily reading of the rule from here on in, start with the vow form. But so we put the schools back in instead of that vague thing about Ministry of Education. And the people were able to accept it because the word vow had been taken out of the second paragraph. So we figured the second paragraph now has historical meaning in terms of what the founder did. All right? Where it's in our formula, it's the third paragraph where the vows are specified. And of course, it's only since the Bull of Approbation that we have poverty, chastity, obedience, and then the other vows, which have now renewed names. But if you look at this thing the way it was in 1694, if you look at this thing the way it is, it's nothing to do with standardized religious orders at all. Blanc is talking all the time as if that were the fundamental issue. And all that long discussion about whether or not to make the vow of chastity. One wonders whether that was that central in the discussion, really. And Blanc makes no reference to the possibility of putting poverty in there. Now, the brothers, of course, were poor, terribly poor. We couldn't live as poor as they did. And they were presumably chaste, more or less. Although some hints in the letters, they may have had a problem with it, as everybody does, I guess. But this is a totally different thing. They're fundamentally vowing to stay together and to work together to keep the gratuitous schools going. That's what they're vowing, and that's their way of bringing about the glory of God. Now, I'd like you to keep this and bring it tomorrow. We'll use this at the prayer at the beginning of our session tomorrow morning, the first paragraph at least. And I would like to suggest that if we could, as the Institute evolves, and as we get more and more serious about the Lasallian family, I wouldn't have any difficulty asking one of our lay associates, married or unmarried, to make this formula their own, without the canonical implications of the word vow. Because the fundamental thing is, and I think we're speaking about some people in the room here, I wouldn't see any difficulty about thinking of Kelly or Andy or Ron as being able to face the Trinity and say that they're consecrating themselves entirely to procure God's glory as far as they're able to require it. And in some form or other, I think people who work with us, and the members of the more intimate members, if you will, of the Lasallian family, do promise to unite with us for the purpose of the educational work that we do, right? And to be under the direction of the society. Now, some of the technicalities of obedience and so on, but if you're a layperson working in any of our schools, you pretty well learn what the obedience is to the director and superior. So you see what I mean? And you have to make this kind of a commitment even if you've got to work for a corporation in a certain sense. I think that this is adaptable to a much wider audience. If we go back to the 1694 one, you'd have a much bigger problem with the canonical stuff that this has evolved into. But it goes back to what I said in the beginning about that. Remember when I picked you up on that business of the vows constituting the society? That it's how willing are you to consecrate yourself to this work and to stick together to do it by association? That's the fundamental reality here, and that's a reality that I think we are beginning to learn to share. Okay, end reflections on the rest.
I'd just like to point out that in the second paragraph, the word unite is the vow of association, and the word remain is the vow of stability. That's why in the last paragraph, when you come to the last clause, it says, which vows, and you say, oh, what does that relative pronoun refer to? It refers all the way back to unite, which vow of association, unite, as well as stability, remain, and of obedience, to do anything in a said society for which I shall be employed. That which refers back to the second paragraph in which all three vows are made. And I think there's a certain loss in taking that word vow out of our present formula in the second paragraph. The second paragraph contains it all, and the last paragraph is simply a reiteration.
And the only problem I have with the reiteration, by the way, is that when the vow of association uses that one word, that has created an awful lot of problems in the discussion too, because people say, well, you're making a vow of association, which is a vow of community. But it isn't association just to associate. It's a vow of association to keep the gratuitous schools.
To keep together.
Yes, well, to keep the schools together, but to keep the school. See,
That's right.
So the way I would put it is to do the apostolic, to fulfill the apostolic mission of the Institute, to exercise the educational ministry. is the formula I would prefer if we're going to put the word vow back in the second paragraph. All right? Because I think we conceive of our mission as wider now than simply keeping gratuitous schools, although that's an element in the whole. So, well, anyway, I really don't want to get too much quoted. All right, Frank, quickly, please.
What bothers me, you mentioned a couple of times that this is a private vow, and I'm wondering what the force and the obligation is if it's just a private vow. I mean, these people are doing it almost, when you listen to it, boy, it sounds solemn and everything, but you have mentioned a few times, it's a private vow. I'm wondering what the obligation of it, the force.
To me, the distinction between private and public is, it's not important. If you are making a vow, if you stand personally before the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I consecrate myself entirely to you to procure your glory as far as I am able and as you require of me. That's an engagement that you make to this person. And it has its intrinsic force. That's all the force it needs as far as I'm concerned. Whether the church, you sign it up and it's a public vow and the church approves and all that stuff and then dispenses it back and forth. I don't think the church can dispense me from a commitment that I've made in that type of a thing. I think I could dispense myself better if I could have faced the Trinity and say I'm no longer capable of what I thought I could do at one point. Huh? That's juridical and legal from my point of view, and I don't have an awful lot of sympathy for it. Okay? So all the business about bishops and approval, et cetera, et cetera. But this is an engagement, huh? Supposing I make a solemn promise to you to do something or other, say this afternoon or next week, to give you that thing that you asked for, right? I promised you that. I made that commitment. Where's the binding force? Huh? It's something that I said I would do for you. Or when a man and a woman get married, huh? They commit themselves to one another. The priest there, he's not even necessary. And they can do it if there isn't any priest around for 30 days, according even to the canon law. So there's the binding force. The binding force is that's where the word promise to me sometimes has more punch than vow. If I make a promise, and especially if I make a solemn promise to somebody, a solemn promise, really under solemn circumstances, that's tough. That's as binding as you can get. We think that that's extremely important, that whole business of what it means when we promise something. Some of these words get a little bit, well, I'm beginning to get oratorical and carried away. But as you can tell, I have so strong convictions on some of these things. So the other thing that takes the third element, the rules, the vows, the third important thing in this thing was the decision, the attempt of the founder to get them to elect a brother to succeed him. And of course, we have that very, very important statement on page 139, 140, whereby they finally persuade the founder that he's not listening to the voice of God, that twice now they voted him in, and he'd better accept it. And he keeps giving all these arguments, and Bland's commentary on them is interesting too. But then finally, at page 139, 140, that text down at the bottom, where the very, very important Institute text, where they agree that from here on in, this sets no precedent whatsoever, and that it's our understanding the present election will not be a precedent. After the said John Baptist de Lasalle, forever in the future, no one shall be received among us or chosen as superior who is a priest or has received sacred orders, and that we will not accept any superior who has not associated himself with us and not made vows like us, and like all those who will be associated with us in the future. All the emphasis is on the association again. We vow to associate to do this work. That's what they're vowing. And so Bland seems to think that the founder sort of conned them into signing it just before the text on page 139 at the bottom. On this point, they were happy to satisfy his desire so as to have him continue without reluctance as the superior, as if the only way they could get him to continue as superior would be on condition that they signed this thing, which apparently Bland hints they did so reluctantly. I don't think that that's true at all. I think that they...
There are two aspects to this. One is that we don't want priests in the brotherhood, and the other one is that they were trying to prevent parish priests from assuming control of the institution.
Exactly, I would think that that's true, sure. Of course, you know, this whole question of the priesthood and the institute is something else, and that could take us for the rest of the morning to discuss that too. I remember the famous statement of Gabe Moran when that was much discussed back in '66, and somebody said, I don't see any reason why a priest can't become a brother.
I
Yes?
just want to point out the legal character of that document, which reflects the Lasallian thinking, the way of thinking, something he inherited from his father. That's a very legal document.
Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, this is not a statement, it's a question. Around 46, wasn't there a question of a priest, I think a Jesuit, being put in charge of the order?
Not that I'm aware of.
No.
Gus?
Well, there was a Jesuit priest who wanted to write our rule for us.
Oh, that may be it.
Yeah.
And he was turned down.
Yeah, he was,
That was it.
Yeah.
Anyway, but his objective to what it was, I thought it was this idea of the priest.
no, that was in just before the general chapter of 1966.
Oh, yeah.
They had prepared a new rule, and Philip Antoon gave it to this Jesuit canonist to look over, and they were proud as punch of the thing, and the Jesuit said, oh, you're way behind the times. We don't think that way anymore in Rome, and that we want a more spiritual type rule. And he said, by the way, I've written one for an order of sisters. I'd be happy to write one for you. So they said, thanks, but no thanks. We've got Michel Sauvage, and so they put him into it.
Could you say a little bit more about what you commented on, about the body of society being more, carrying more weight than this?
Well, I think that reinforces something that Gus has been insisting on, you know, that the founder was trying to give these men a sense of themselves as a unity, a community, and a society, and that he trusted them to do things together. It's another aspect of the association, huh? That this was your commitment was to this group of men. Again, in the modern terms we use to talk about these things, which I think we recovered in the Book of Government in 1976, not in 66, was to get away from that pyramidal thing of this is superior at the top and all the way down and so on, although the founder is strong in obedience and all that sort of stuff, but to recognize that the decisions of the body of the society are the things that these people are committing themselves to, and that their superiors are the ones who implement that or manage it, if you will, or bring it into reality, but that the fundamental commitment is to the body of the society. It's an aspect of what the association means, I would say. Okay? All right, good. So now this period between 1694 and 99, it's sometimes referred to as a period of relative peace. The founder was at Vaugirard. He was able to hone up on a lot of his writings. You have all of that. In 1695, there are a couple of dates in here, 1695. I haven't got them up on the board. That's where the dispute with Baudrin occurs. This, all of a sudden, Baudrin decides he wants to move the brothers out of the Rue Princesse, where they had fairly ample quarters, and move them around the corner to the Rue Guiscard, which is still there. And de La Salle didn't like the house at all. And he thought it was quite inadequate and so he refused to move. So Baudrin says, well, I won't pay the rent anymore. So de La Salle says, well, I'll pay the rent. Well, where are you going to get it? Well, Providence will provide, and apparently it did. But then when he gets in trouble later on, then there's a whole problem about who owns that house and who's paying the rent, and so on, as we'll see when he gets in the dispute. Meanwhile, Cardinal Noailles, or he becomes Archbishop first, down from Chalon, so in 1695, he also becomes the Archbishop. And one of his first movements of reform in Paris is to close down all of these private chapels, where people, instead of going to Mass in their parishes, they should do what they do here at St. Mary's and come to a private chapel to fulfill their obligation on Sunday. And they do that in a lot of our colleges, including Manhattan for a while, sometimes still. So again, but he's so impressed with de La Salle and his reputation, and he's known something of that had filtered up from Reims over to Chalon. So he gives the founder carte blanche in many ways. He gives him faculties for life, which come in very handy later on, and so on and so forth. And he gives approval then for putting a chapel in the novitiate. Now that may seem strange to us. You say, of course, if you have a novitiate, you have a chapel, but that wasn't so, as we know from the account, where they had to go to the local church of St. Lambert, or to one of the local chapels by preference instead of the church. And so De La Salle gets in a big fight with the pastor. Blanc can't resist bringing up the whole question of the brothers going to church with their students, or the brothers having their own chapels and so on, because this, as we'll see, it comes in at the end of the founder's life, and it's really what was behind the whole business of the founder being deprived of his faculties in Rouen just a couple of days before he dies. But Blanc, since Blanc is in Rouen and writing everything that's going on in Rouen, somehow or other gets incorporated back into the early text, either by putting it where it doesn't belong or mentioning something that really belongs at a later period. So we'll see this issue arise again. In 1696, we meet for the first time the new pastor of Saint-Sulpice, who is Joachim Trotti de la Chétardy. And Chétardy will be seeing an awful lot of him, especially tomorrow. And in some sense, he becomes, now, keep your eye on this thing. We get a couple of them in today's reading. We had two references in today's reading to the fact that through all of this, there's an enemy at work. Huh? And and at the same time, Blanc is saying wonderful things about this Chétardy person and how wonderful he is and how distinguished, which of course apparently he was. Huh? So Hernandez, what page is that on? I should have it someplace here. Where Hernandez has a little footnote, page 149. In 1697, he says, actually it was 1696. Blanc can almost be counted on to get the dates wrong. He gets through pastor. Shows no other good work interested him to such a degree as that of the Christian and gratuitous schools. He had inherited not only the parish, but also the piety of de la Barmondière and Baudrin. And he surpassed them in his generosity towards the brothers. And he even seemed to envy De La Salle the honor of having endowed the church with such a necessary institute. Blanc's got the motives again. And Hernandez remarks in the footnote, quoting Rigaud, this gives us a key to the entire history of the conflict which later on opposed De La Chétardy to the saint and led to so much difficulty in the latter. So Chétardy, that's a question. Is the enemy the same person as Chétardy? Because on the same page all the time, Blanc will be saying that Chétardy is the greatest person that ever came along, and in the same page he'll be talking about the enemy. And so what is the correspondence between the two? And that'll be part of what we have to look at tomorrow. Of course, now I have to tell every group this, and I can't deprive you of an experience that I had with regard to De La Chétardy. In 1971, I was given a sabbatical from Manhattan College. I had just finished 8 years as the chairman of the department and running a graduate program and so on, with very little time to read or do anything, catch up. So they turned me loose, and I decided the best place to go to catch up on what was going on in European theology and in contemporary theology was to go to Louvain in Belgium. So I said to myself, well, how do I get to Louvain? So I took a plane to New Orleans, where I was stuck for 6 days waiting for a freighter. Skeptic that I was never sure the world was round, so I would prove it to myself. If you're going to be stuck for 6 days, I highly recommend New Orleans. So finally the freighter arrived, and I hopped on it and went across the Pacific and stopped in Hong Kong and got off at Manila and stayed with the brothers there for a little while, and then flew to Bangkok, and from there to Delhi, and went up to Agra and saw the Taj Mahal and all that. Came back to Delhi, and I was due to fly from Delhi to Frankfurt. And while I was up in Delhi, foolishly, the very last day I was there, in a hurry to have lunch to catch the plane, I made the mistake of ordering a cold chicken sandwich. And that night, back in Delhi, ready to get the plane in the middle of the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning or some god-awful time. It wasn't Montezuma that had his revenge, but the chicken sandwich certainly did. And so I was in agony all the way from Delhi to Frankfurt and Frankfurt to Brussels. And I arrived in the brothers' community in Louvain in this very embarrassing state of not having very much vowel control. So the Belgian brothers among themselves, they said, oh, the poor American brother has just arrived. And they said in Dutch, "Il a un bezoek de Monsieur de la Chitardie." I had a visit from Monsieur de la Chitardie. So this was the Flemish way of referring to this particular person. Now you can begin to understand a little bit that costume that Chris Kavanaugh was wearing, because when that group did the Buttimer Follies, of course, with the cape and everything else, you know, the villain comes in and so on and so forth. And that's why he made clear that he was pronouncing it Chitardie, when I was afraid he was going to give away my story, and maybe he did, but anyway. So, and then of course, the other funny part of that is that I wasn't at all aware of the man's first name, huh? But his middle name, his name is, how do you say Joaquin, I guess in French, huh? Joaquin Trotti, T-R-O-T-T-I. That's his middle name. So that only reinforced the story a little bit. So anyway, you have now been introduced to him, and it's good to be aware of that if we're going to party with these people tonight, who took all of this stuff and put it into what got to be known as the Buttimer Follies. Did any of you see it last year at the convocation? Yeah, they put it on at the convocation. Some of you may have seen it. They're not going to do it this year, but at least you got to look at the costumes with the wider and wider brims all the time. It's too bad they didn't bring Madame Mayfair with her, because she's here. She's that Jean Leahy who's with the Buttimer 3 group. So okay, so we have Chitardie in place. 1697, the school, and the beginning, of course, he's very, very enthusiastic about these schools, is Baudrillard. This is his parish. Huh? So he opens up the 3rd school in the parish in 1697, and this is on the Rue Placide. Look, I hope you locate all these places on your map. Look at the map as you read these things. That's right down the block from Rue de Sèvres, by the way. It's right on the corner of Rue de Sèvres and the Rue Placide. It's a 2-minute walk from Rue de Sèvres if you're ever in Paris. And this is a very successful school. It succeeds very rapidly. They have to double the classes. Chitardie has all these rich women. This parish, apparently, they must have had a wonderful ladies' auxiliary in this parish. So Madame Voisin is very interested in helping the brothers and giving them what they need for the school, and Chitardie comes there with her and so on, and he's proud as punch of the place and so on. But here again, the schoolmasters begin to, he's again invading the territory of one of the schoolmasters. So they vandalize the school. De La Salle comes and he sees he can't do anything to stop them, so he says, why don't you take me along with you? So in this instance, they say, oh, it's not you that's the problem, it's the brothers. With Chitardie, of course, it turns to be quite the other way around. So that's kind of an exciting story, but they wound up with 4 classes there, twice what they would have in an ordinary school. Okay, so then we have a period of expansion. The first expansion takes place within Paris itself in 1698, when Vaugirard proves to be finally too small. And so they're able finally to get, the founder is able to get enough bucks together to be able to rent this very large thing that at one time had been a convent called the Grande Maison. It had a reputation for being haunted by the ghosts of the old nuns who used to live there and so on, so he got it at a fairly decent price. And it's at this stage that De La Salle begins to see that the administrative duties of the Institute are much too great for him to handle personally, so he appoints another brother, a brother Michel, he's not mentioned by Blanc, as the director of novices, and he appoints another brother as the director of the Paris community, and that turns out to be our friend Ponce. And Gus has already filled you in on the story of Ponce. So, and Blanc will fill us in on some of the subsequent things of that. Notice on page 150, Blanc's judgment here. In the next to the last paragraph, right in the middle. So too, God several times allowed De La Salle to make some serious mistakes in the choice of men to represent him. Very interesting comment. And these two certainly proved to be serious mistakes in the light of the trouble to follow, that leads us into what we're going to have to look at tomorrow. And if you go to page 155, at the end of the 3rd paragraph, it's the first mention, I believe, of the enemy. On this page, he's talking about how Madame Voisin gives 7,000 livres, $70,000 to furnish the house. And these furnishings the founder will keep hold of. As he keeps moving the novitiate, he moves the furnishings of Madame Voisin along with him. So now they finally have beds and mattresses and curtains and things, which they never had at Vaugirard. And so Blount feels it necessary to remind you that if their dwelling was become more livable, their lifestyle didn't become more pleasant. They still didn't get good meals or anything, so on and so forth. And at the end of that paragraph, he says, as the number of novices increased, so did their fervor. Never had the institute been so flourishing. In a short time it began to spread like a great tree, covering Paris and then all of France, and bearing fruit, if the enemy had not succeeded in checking its progress. So he's great on the enemy. He'll develop a second enemy when the founder gets down to Marseille, and that creates other problems of identification. So then while he's in the Grand Maison, we have the King James II coming along with his Irish lads. Foutet has done a little bit more trying to fill out some of the information about the Irish lads, so we don't hear it. They disappear pretty much after this first year. There's a lot of interesting speculation about them. Would the founder, for example, have taught them Latin? He very well may have. He himself knew Latin, and they might have been needing Latin since they were expected to live at the level of the nobility. Would it have been an adventure into secondary education, where they probably were not as young as the young kids in the grammar schools? A lot of questions about those Irish people. And interestingly enough, when the king comes to visit, the brothers want to push the founder to use that occasion to ask for letters patent, to have James II use his influence with Louis XIV to get letters patent. He says, no, it's not the time. I'm not ready for that yet. And of course, Blount, who's aware that the Institute has recently received letters patent, as he's got a big hang-up on the letters patent, and he brings them in every once in a while as if they already had them. Not as exactly as if they already had them, but he anticipates. They're all jumping with joy all over one another about letters patent and approval from Rome, which had happened shortly before Blount was writing. And so that's an interest that he has, and he's always sowing little hints and seeds about it. Then the Rue Placide is vandalized, but it's Madame de Maintenon, again she was very much involved with the king, and was the one the king finally married her after she was able to persuade him to give up his mistress and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff about Madame de Maintenon. It's not as fresh in my mind as I wish it were at the moment. But she's able to get the furnishings restored at the Rue Placide, or at least to allow them to continue against the writing masters, so that they lose round 2. So the writing masters are defeated, or the schoolmasters rather, are defeated first in the Rue du Bac, where the founder wins over them, and also again at the Rue Placide. Neither of those come to anything. But it's building up, and we'll see that thing burst out in full fury tomorrow. All right, now an important development in 1699 as part of this expansion in Paris itself, before we get outside of Paris, is I suppose I should put those in here. I should have in the outline. So we have in Paris, Grand Maison, and the Teacher Training Center at St. Hippolyte in the Faubourg Saint-Marcel. So this pastor, who hears about the founder and the schools and so on, first of all, he's got money to endow a school, and then he asks the founder if he couldn't, and the founder was very interested, in setting up a teacher training school. And so he sets up this teacher training school in the parish of St. Hippolyte, and he sends Brother Nicholas Vouillard there to supervise it. So Vouillard is supervising the teacher training school, and then another brother with him is taking care of the gratuitous school. And they developed this school to train. Again, this was in a suburb area, and the pastor may have known about the thing in Reims, but he saw the need he knew the founder's position about not, on that map it doesn't look very far, but it's a pretty long walk even today to get down into this area. I did it once, and I thought I could walk it, and it took longer than I expected. But anyway, so this training school is set up, and you have the description here of the whole thing going on. And so But eventually, the thing falls apart. Now, we'll see more about this in detail tomorrow, but we can't, just in case you missed it, I'm sure you probably didn't. I don't have a page reference here. Can anybody help me with the page right away? 161. So he gets going on Vuillard, and of course he's the Judas, huh, Frank? And he's going on him strongly and strongly. So I love the passage on the bottom of 162. The perfidy. So when the school, when the pastor who had this legacy, was afraid that the school would not survive after him. So he wanted to leave this in his will, that this would be taken care of. Now, he couldn't leave it to the Institute because the Institute had no corporate status. And he didn't seem to want to leave it to De La Salle because De La Salle was not on the scene. Vuillard was the best chosen representative of De La Salle, so he figured rightly that it would be safe enough to leave the money to Vuillard. But when the thing fell apart, then Vuillard decided to treat that as his own money and refused to give it to the founder because he wanted it for the school. So Blanc has this lovely passage. The perfidious disciple of whom we have spoken survived his master, but not for long. After continuing the school in the parish for over 20 years, so Vuillard stayed there teaching. You have ever seen that movie of Burkhardt, by the way, when he has Vuillard in secular clothes, really dressed up and treating brother. He fell ill of a mortal ailment the day after De La Salle died. The servant of God died on Good Friday, April 7th. And it seemed that on the very next day, what was his first agenda when he got to heaven? He interested heaven in avenging a crime which during his life he had pardoned so wholeheartedly. Oh, heaven must be a lovely place if you could get even with your enemy. The former brother fell ill on Holy Saturday, the day the servant of God was buried, and after 5 months of suffering, he went to give an account to his judge for the tremendous injustice he had been guilty of towards the church, for the affront he had offered his superior, for the scandalous desertion which had shocked his community, and for the complete ruin of the training college for the country schoolmasters which he had brought about. Well, as we will see tomorrow, it isn't that simple. What of course really happened is that there was a court judgment forbidding the brothers personally to operate any kind of an educational institution in association with De La Salle. And this confronted Vuillard and the brother who was with him with a choice. If they continued to wear the habit and continued to have any association with De La Salle, they couldn't continue the school. So Vuillard decided that to save the training college, to keep the training college going, he would abandon the habit and publicly have nothing to do with De La Salle, in order to satisfy what the writing masters by that time had been able to get as a court judgment. The other brother decided to stick with De La Salle and left Vuillard, but then the training school collapsed because it was only Vuillard, and then the money dried up. Vuillard, although he took the money, tales aren't. Have to be a little fresher on this, but then so Vuillard is able to continue to teach in the grammar school, and he does so for 20 years, and probably pretty effectively. So Vuillard is not really a traitor. He was trying to do what he thought was the best thing possible to salvage the training college. Now, of course, he had made that heroic vow, but there again, the vow he made, of course, he undoubtedly made the perpetual vows to obey the body of the society, but the body of the society was no longer, it had no longer had any existence. So there's a lot that could be said in justification of Vuillard. Phil?
I couldn't find the name of the parish priest. Do we know his name?
Isn't it in there someplace?
I looked and looked, unless I missed it. I was curious since he left all the money and all that sort of thing, but I just couldn't find it.
I think from other sources we may know who it is. I think we may get his name when the lawsuit comes up. Let's wait till then, and I'm pretty sure we know it. But offhand, I can't tell you what it is. Okay. As you can see, I have almost as much trouble being prepared for this stuff as you do. Then we get the whole expansion. Now, while all this crazy stuff is going on, we have, first of all, the association with Bishop Godet de Marais. Hernandez writes it this way. I meant to check how Ballin writes it. Actually, his name is de Marais. Marais is the French word for swamps. And this is the swamp area near where we have that school of the Franc Bourgeois today. That whole area where the Place Royale is and where Barré was living is known as Les Marais in Paris. And so they had the title to that land, and so that family did. And he had been an associate of de La Salle's. Well, he's very supportive of the brothers and the schools and so on and so forth. And Blanc, as usual, carries the story forward to the troubles that the brothers had under their successor, and the fact that when the Institute finally did get letters patent in 1725, that incorporation of St. Jan was able to be extended to Chartres. So there's a whole problem there of the Institute in Chartres, and at one point they tried to turn the Institute into a kind of monastic order, and there's a lot of statement about that, and so on, but this was a significant development, and you could go into a lot of detail about this. Chartres is just a little bit southwest of Paris. Calais is all the way up in the English Channel, and so we have the development there of a school in Calais, and then later on in Boulogne, and the problems with the association with the bishop. The interesting thing about that, of course, is the finances. How did they finance the schools in Calais? Where'd they get the money? The confiscated property of the Huguenots.
Oh, dear.
So the king says, oh yeah, we got a lot of money to support these things. We just confiscated a lot of these property belonging to these Huguenots, took all their money away from them, so they said, use that to pay the brothers. So it's not a very ecumenical kind of a thing. And then in Troyes, which is still in the Champagne country, but that's south of Paris, and then the movement to Rome, the importance of Rome, and Avignon. I guess maybe we better start tomorrow with saying something about the importance of the Avignon Foundation and the movement of Roland to Rome. But if you've done the reading, you're ready for not only reading the letters of Gabriel Roland, but also we've seen where he comes in the narrative.
Did Desmarais and de La Salle have a big fight about the religious habit?
No, over the Latin.
Latin?
That's the binding point.